world. I'm highlighting the World Bank at this point in the talk because I believe the World Bank is one of the leading producers of knowledge on development, one of the leading producers of development ideology, and so I'll be coming back quite frequently to some of the thinking that has gone on at the bank over time. We see the strategic use of foreign aid announced in 1947 with the Truman Doctrine that the United States will be sending aid to Greece and Turkey to prevent communist takeovers of those countries. The Marshall Plan is a large-scale transfer of resources from the United States to Europe for the purpose of rebuilding and reconstruction. There's specific reconstruction in Germany and Japan. And then 1949 is the moment at which people really point to the birth of the modern aid industry. It builds in part on these technical assistance programs from earlier in the 1940s, but it's in 1949 during his State of the Union address that President Harry S. Truman announces the Point 4 program, and the fourth point of his speech is to transfer technical knowledge from the United States to the underdeveloped parts of the world. And I pause on underdevelopment because it's the first time that this word is used in a major policy speech, in a major policy initiative. And so Truman effectively creates two worlds, the developed world and the underdeveloped or developing world. And it's from that mindset out of which much of our modern thinking on development and our modern patterns of aid giving grow. This notion that wealthy countries of the world should be giving aid spreads quite rapidly. So Germany, which had been receiving reconstruction aid in the 1940s, in 1953 it creates its own aid agencies. Its goal in giving aid is quite commercially based. Germany is hoping to create export markets for this revitalized German industry, so it's looking to create consumers in non-European countries around the world. Japan acts and continues to act quite similarly in its motivations for aid giving. As countries throughout Africa and South Asia emerge from colonialism, the UK and the French in particular build aid systems that are oriented towards providing resources to those countries for the purposes of economic development. The Soviet Union, beginning in the 1950s, begins sending aid to socialist states and maybe socialist states in order to encourage them to be part of the Soviet bloc. In the 1960s, we see the northern European countries, Norway, Sweden, Denmark, entering into the aid-giving game, and they have somewhat of an ideological purpose of promoting social democracy with their assistance. So this is to give you some sense that in most cases aid is not directly or in the first place motivated by a desire for economic development. That aid is motivated by geostrategic interests, winning the war against communism or for communism, depending on which side you are on, motivated by commercial interests, hoping to create markets in which you can sell domestically produced goods. But the use of aid was also expected to bring about economic development. This was a goal, even if these other goals were present or perhaps even primary. So how? What was the first developmental ideology that was in place? Well, beginning in the 1940s and into the 1950s, the dominant idea is that foreign aid can fill a financing gap. That the poor countries in the world suffer from this problem where their domestic populations are not saving enough, and therefore investment is not occurring at the rate that it needs to occur in order to bring about economic growth. This is the first major idea in development economics thinking. Development economics is essentially a body of knowledge that is created beginning at the end of the Second World War. That the advent of decolonization, the sense that there is two worlds, a poor world and a wealthy world, a third world and a first world, leads to the need for theorizing on how that poor world can be made more like the rich world. And this is the first dominant idea that comes into fruition, that there is a savings gap, that there's also a foreign exchange gap, that these poor countries of the world don't have enough foreign currency, and that those gaps can be filled with external transfers, with money coming from the wealthy countries of the world, going into those countries where there is a savings gap, that the lack of savings can be replaced with foreign funds that will lead to investment, and then the investment in things like buildings, factories, machines will bring about economic takeoff, will bring about economic growth. So this idea has legacies to the present day. But in the 1970s, a sense begins to grow that filling the financing gap and providing the type of technical assistance that had been provided since the early 1940s is not enough. That economic growth is not actually being stimulated merely by transferring these resources and attempting to transfer some knowledge. So under President Robert McNamara, the World Bank, he's president of the World Bank, he might have liked to have been president of the United States. Under Robert McNamara, who takes office at the World Bank in 1968 after he has been shuffled off from running the war in Vietnam any longer, he decides that the bank should be more directly concerned with poverty. This notion of filling a financing gap, of providing money for investment that's going to lead to economic growth, is very economic growth focused and less focused on the problems of poverty. So McNamara comes into the bank with this idea, and then in 1973 he gives a speech in Nairobi in which he describes absolute poverty. He describes what it's like to live in immiserated circumstances, and he says that the development agencies that exist in the world need to pay more attention to this. This becomes then the dominant idea, and the other relevant aid agencies, the United States and the United Kingdom as major donors, follow suit. This idea persists through the 1970s. There are massive programs aimed at poverty alleviation, but by the end of the decade, it's already being eclipsed. The notion that foreign aid actors should focus on alleviating poverty and on reducing poverty per se is already losing its momentum within a decade. As Roger Riddle points out, or as he describes it, within a decade of having discovered poverty, donors began to forget about it already. And I point this out in particular because it presages what's going to happen, which is today sort of the revitalization of thinking about poverty as compared to economic growth. So this movement away from being focused on poverty is what's going to lead to being focused instead on structural adjustment lending and on policy reforms that are going to come to be summarized using the phrase the Washington Consensus. Why does this happen? I'm going to talk about two enabling conditions in the world that result in the birth of the structural adjustment era. The first is about the middle income and poor countries in the world. The oil crisis in the mid-1970s and then again in the late 1970s led to massive borrowing in order to finance imports. Imports became more expensive as the price of oil went up. These countries borrowed massively. They developed huge balance of payments deficits. They needed foreign currency. And you see there the chart of borrowing in Latin America from 1970 into the 1980s. A huge run-up in borrowing beginning in the mid-1970s. So there is a very substantial need among the middle-income countries and among the poorest countries in the world for foreign currency, such as that is provided by international donors. The second thing, and I really want to highlight this, is that within donor agencies, there are bureaucratic incentives